I guess we have an echo. Sorry about that. With stuff like package managers, frameworks, nice tool you can use. Who wants to be the first one to talk about that?
We either speak about nice tools or Swiss Packet Manager, right? It can be both. I'm just kidding.
No. Actually, sorry. It's my it's my bad to compare those things. You're totally right. No, come on. First one who wants to.
Back to Anna.
Well, I can start if no one has nothing to say. Well, we in Russia use a lot of different tools for our project, and it's really normal if you want to create something very special and to use different libraries that can automate and to make easy your way to compose your code. For example, we also use a lot of libraries, for example, LMFire, different JSON parsers, and etc. Some things just like Realm, we use best practices, and we also create different conferences where we discuss what are the best practices in our code. But also there is some directions, such as some specialty, such as financial software, and there is some rules that they use only third-party libraries that they have created themselves, or they prefer to use only native tools to achieve all the same results. So no third-party libraries for network, for storages, only bare native iOS SDK and so on. And of course, we also use package manager. I like these tools, and it's unfortunately not all my favorite libraries already support package manager.
Okay, what about, I mean, I have a list of you. I'll try to go around with some insights. So Vincent, you're next. What's your insights about that?
I mean, for third-party tool, I would say there are some must-have for iOS project. It's the tools that provide the basic feature that basically Xcode is kind of lacking. I'm thinking of, for instance, SwiftLint. I have a hard time imagining a project that involves a team that wouldn't use SwiftLint because there is just so much advantage and so little drawback. But I also agree that it makes sense to try and minimize your dependencies to third parties, especially if you anticipate that you're maybe going to want to adopt new features from Apple very fast. I'm thinking, for instance, when Catalyst was released and you wanted to port your app to the Mac using Catalyst, well, basically almost all of the binaries dependencies, they wouldn't work. And so you had to remove them from your app if you could, but if you couldn't, you were stuck. So it's a risk that must be integrated. I know some companies that make their own product and they say we really want to minimize dependencies. I think maybe they use like just Promise Kit, and probably they're using Combine now this way, no dependencies. But third-party tools, things like SwiftLint or Sorcery, I think it's a bit different because they are tools, and if at some point they break, your project is still going to build. I mean, they're not going to be like a showstopper, we could say.
Totally agree. They help a lot with keeping the code clean. We use that a lot as well.
Can I speak now? Because Vincent raised some points I wanted to talk about. So when you think about third-party tooling, right, there are things that are dependencies, like direct dependencies to your code base, and things that force you into specific decisions. For example, if you use a tool that forces you to inherit from a base class, your whole project now relies on that library still working. So if there are system updates, stuff like that, you might be in a complete, you just dig up a hole for yourself, right? Because if that library now doesn't support the new version of the iOS or doesn't support Catalyst, you cannot progress, you cannot really do anything. And removing that from your project, now it's like a cancer. It's really hard. It's, you know, it's spread through everywhere. So those kind of dependencies are really hard to get rid of. And then you have the kind of tools like Vincent mentioned, like SwiftLint, Swift format, obviously sorcery, tribute, those things. Even if they break, the worst thing that can happen is you will have to do those things by hand. But if you didn't use those tools before, you're already doing it by hand. So as long as they work, and they have been working for like 5-6 years, some of them, right? As long as they work, you're saving time. If they ever stop working, you just remove it from your project and nothing has to change. You just go into maintaining it by hand, right? So there's no risk there. Also, those tools, like I cannot imagine them being a problem for any kind of application, like security-wise, because the changes they do, they are very clear. They are in the code base and they're reviewed as normal code. So like saying you couldn't use sorcery in like a financial app makes no sense, because sorcery doesn't actually end up in your code, right? It just generates your code. So you still are responsible for reviewing that. And so the tools that are part of your build process, you can always use. And the way I choose the stuff that I want to use, and also the way I design a lot of the tools I build, is I make it easy for you to remove my stuff. Right? Every single library that I have built, I build in a way that doesn't force you to like inherit from my classes. It doesn't force you to follow a specific design pattern. It's just like it's like a pure function. Like a lot of the stuff, like the first open source thing I did was property mapper, and that was the time that everyone was using Mantle or RESTKit. RESTKit, was it? The core data.
Unfortunately, that's RESTKit, but you bring me bad memories to my...
So RESTKit required you to inherit from their core data, right? So if you decided to use RESTKit for ORM mapping, which is like one mapping from the server, your whole project now had to be core data. If you wanted to use Mantle back then, your whole project had to inherit from Mantle. And like, I wrote property mapper because when I wanted to do the data mapping from the server, I was like, why do I have to do that? Like, the only thing I want to do is I have this format coming from the server and I just want to put it into my native layer. And so I built the property mapper as a pure function, and people used it for many years. Like Tinder used it for like 7 or 8 years before they switched. And if you wanted to remove it, you simply remove the library, and there was like literally every object you had has a simple single function that just called into the property mapper static function. That was all. There was no dependency other than that, right? So that's how I, design stuff and how I consider whether I want to use something. Because when you use a dependency that spreads through your whole project, and now your whole project relies on that one thing working, you better hope that you understand the source code. So if you're using something like Eric's Swift and you're depending on it, you better understand that implementation. Because if something happens and you have to fix it quickly, open source, generally people fix things, right? Popular projects get fixed. But if there is like a very, very time-sensitive manner, like you need to do a security update or something, you better know how to do it yourself, because the open source might not be fast enough. So just wanted to add that.
Totally agree with that. I mean, sometimes there's a trade-off between what you gain in terms of dependencies and what you maybe can or cannot do by yourself. Marcin, you're next. Your thoughts about this?
Yeah, so definitely the dependency depends on the project itself and the company. Like the startup will probably go fast and use whatever is possible to build the next iteration, and we'll think about removing the dependency afterwards. And I was working in such a setup, and yeah, it's good for that kind of iteration. This is a short-living project and code base, most likely, that will be rewritten and so on. So yeah, then you can just widely go and use whatever you want. And startups not even look for the license, so you really can use whatever you want. If you work with a more established corporation, they definitely will ask you, what do you use, why do you use, and what is the license to, so before you even try to include the dependency, like a framework dependency, into your project, it will go through the lawyers or something that will accept that. So in that time, you may think twice whether you really need that or not. So I find it like a good way. So you can back and say, okay, I don't really need that. It's a 1 day of my work, and I will do that on my own, and that maybe will be sufficient for your needs. You maybe don't need the whole framework. When it comes to tools, though, I agree in general that the tools that are implemented in a way that does not affect the process are great. But there are also tools like Python, what is dependency, Ruby, which is the dependency, and just recently with the Ruby and the M1 MacBooks, we see there are problems if you have a setup that uses that kind of scripting, and suddenly, well, you have to switch. So what I'm doing, I'm starting with a bash script, like a scripting scripts, not using Python nor Ruby. So this is for me the most multi-platform. Like I can just use it because it's established and it works. Same with like Fastlane. If it depends on the Fastlane and on your deliverable, and Apple change something on a website, and you have to push the application update today, well, you better know what is inside the Fastlane, right? Otherwise, you really have to do all that manually, and you may be not skilled to do all that stuff. So it really depends. I would go as simple as possible for tooling and dependencies. I use, of course, dependencies, but it really depends on the project itself.
Well, about Fastlane, I mean, I'm sorry there's Josh is not involved in this roundtable, but he will be with us today. But I think it's the fastest pull request resolver and bug resolver I ever seen, because it's the way he is maintaining the whole report with all the other contribution is really amazing. I wanted to give
sure. I mean, it was just an example. There are other tools like that you rely on. Your whole architecture relies on.
Yeah, I have also issues with other tools, unfortunately, I'm using, and they're not maintained as quick as I would. So I totally agree with you. Fabrizio, what about you, which is actually here, but what about you?
Yeah, as said by Marcin, it depends on your needs. So you have to choose your dependencies or your tools carefully. For example, we use Xcode for product generation, and it will avoid a lot of conflicts on the pull request side. So this is what we are currently using for that. And on the resources side, we use SwiftGen, for example, and we also use SwiftLint for the code formatting. And we are currently trying to use the official one made by Apple, Swift format. That is quite different from the SwiftLint, but it has some good points.
Sorry, was mute. We use those kind of dependencies as well. I mean, we know that they can fail at some point. And something I would like, sorry if I put myself in the middle, but I would encourage everyone to try to do open source projects and contribute to every repository. Don't be shy, don't be afraid to, I don't know, write something that it's not proper. Maintainers always need some qualified help. So please help us maintaining our repos.
It's not a universal approach to dependencies, though. I would agree, because you may have a dependency and say, okay, I will just issue the pull request with the changes I want, but that might be not in line with the author of the dependency, so it will never be integrated with the dependency. So you will stick with your fork forever, and then you have another work maintaining the fork with the upstream changes of the dependency, which is even more work. So Yeah, it's good. Definitely, it's good to contribute, but it's not the ultimate solution to all the needs, I would say.
No, I meant for. I mean, sometimes people don't dare to get involved with maintainers, and I mean, from my point of view, it's something that shouldn't be. Someone should be ashamed to do that. Of course, you cannot agree with maintainers and whatsoever, and other forks. I mean, there's a Carthage one who has been recently the NS operation one, which is a totally different approach to Carthage, as I am aware of. But anyway, no, of course, the maintainer is there for a reason and should lead the project, like in real life, of course. So I'm going to skip Anna for the moment. Sorry about that, as she started talking before. Bruno.
Yeah, so I actually share a lot with what Krzysztof said, because I think the biggest problem when you use third-party anything is you becoming hostage to the actual thing that you're using. So when I build something like, say, professional in a company, I try to build all the functionality ourselves, first party, for control reasons. The thing is, if you use a third-party library, it's great because it saves a lot of time. But if something goes wrong, then you depend on the goodwill of the person who actually wrote the library to help you out. You're going to have to search if someone had that issue, and then you may have to ask whoever is maintaining it, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, if you build it yourself, then you actually, you probably know what's going on and you have some capability of actually fixing it. But I like using third-party libraries and tools when there's a massive benefit to it. For example, SwiftLink is a no-brainer. There's no downside to using something like this. In regards to libraries, I really like Cartography and PromiseKit. I think are some of the best libraries made for iOS. It just completely outweighs the cost of you having actually to develop it. So that's something that I think the biggest problem is actually becoming hostage of it.
Okay, totally agree with that. I mean, what about you, Leah? I mean, you're next. If you want to share some insights about this.
Sure. So first of all, I'd like to agree with my peers here that when we're discussing tooling, there's really not much argument. But actual libraries, there are some also that it's definite benefit to use. Within reason, of course, you have to take into consideration licensing and security. I remember an issue many years back when I was working at Glide that one of our apps that we submitted was rejected for misuse of the advertising identifier. We're like, what? We don't even use the advertising identifier, but guess what? One of our dependencies did. So that was an issue. So sometimes you get stuck with having to deal with backlash from things that you didn't even write. However, there are some things that I feel like there's no reason to reinvent the wheel for. For instance, I'm a fan of using a logging library like Cocoa Lumberjack or Swifty Beaver, and definitely when prototyping, then using third-party libraries makes a lot of sense because you just need to get something out there, check how it's working, and then coming up with your own solutions may outweigh the benefit of having used the third-party library to begin with.
Yeah, sorry, I got my layout here changed. Andrea, up to you. What about you guys?
I definitely agree with my peers. At Just Eat, as a big company, as a big app, we try as our colleagues to have a very, very few external dependencies. We actually have a lot of open source libraries we created that we made open source on GitHub. But I remember, for example, we were using, and I think we are still actually using somewhere in the app, a library called Eureka to create forms. And that was a decision made in the past, due to some reasons. Maybe the team was doing very, very fast things. Maybe there were a lot of forms to create, and for example, they didn't want to handle the keyboard, which is something Eureka does. But now today, we decided to get rid of it because it's time to move away and build our own solution. So we are slowly replacing this open source solution with something we built in-house. And it's kind of a pain, because once you have this open source tool, especially, for example, in the checkout screen, our checkout screen is built in Eureka, which is kind of probably one of the most important screens we have in the app. Replacing that with our own solution, it's a pain. It's really a pain. So when you want to use an open source framework, just keep in mind, especially for long term in your app, what are your objectives, your mission, for probably how long the code will stay there, how much important is that part of the app, and all these kind of things. But definitely for startups, definitely for them, it's way quicker to use an open source framework, because probably they're going to build features that in 6 months or 1 year, they'll be completely different. And so they have, the need to be extremely fast. But for probably big apps, before using an open source framework, it's just a matter of understanding pros and cons. But we are part of the Swiftling family. We use Swiftling too. So that's a great tool. So yeah, that's basically our story.
Okay, and what about you, Firas? I think you're the last, but not intended. Sorry.
No, don't worry, no worries. I'm actually echo everything that everyone said. As Fabrizio mentioned, since we work together, we do use a couple of great tools. Xcode Gen mainly, that helps us really avoid having to deal with dealing with the Xcode prods when pulling requests and everything. And because we're a team of 8, so it gets really chaotic if we didn't have that tool. So tooling, as everybody said, since it doesn't really break your app, if it doesn't work, it just doesn't work, and you just do it by hand. Whereas for dependencies, we generally don't use that many. I think I'm actually stunned that nobody mentioned it, but we're big fans of Alamofire, because Matt has a great track record in general. So and Alamofire helps us a lot with not having to worry about security issues and everything, even though they had to deal with them themselves, but they got around it and fixed it fast. So Alamofire is a big dependency that we use, and we have our own layer on top of it to adapt to our needs, obviously. And I agree with, I think it was, I'm not sure it was Krzysztof or Vincent that said, no, or Marcin, sorry, that said that when you have it, when you use a dependency, an open source dependency, you have to be ready to deal with whenever it gets discontinued or not supported or maintained, or if you need to do a quick fix or everything. And actually we had to deal with that a few times, because we use a couple of other dependencies, which are Katana and Tempura for our stateful architecture. The reason why we opted for those is because we are familiar with the code base. So I used to work at Bending Spoons, so I actually properly know the code base. And if we need ever to just fork it and have our own version and maintain it, we are more than capable to do so. So that's really important, to know the tools you're using. And generally speaking, if you have time to recreate something, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, that's for sure. But it's also not a good choice to include a big library for one class that you can just do it yourself. So it's really a matter of everything has pros and cons. So as long as the solution outweighs the problem, that it may or may not cause, it's a good choice to go with tooling. But generally, we do not personally. We use a lot of tooling, but not a lot of dependencies. Especially that CocoaPods recently has been down every time we want to work with it. So.
Yeah, actually, there's a lot of issues with CocoaPods being down. Sometimes it's cartridge not properly updated due to the big changes with XG frameworks, and I think the lead maintainers have changed during the time. Swift Package Manager, yeah, but not always, and I mean sometimes it gets really difficult also to detect which is the best package manager to use that. There was some irony before from Marcin, but what would you advise? I mean, what are your, did you ever in the last period had some issues with that? My main issue using package manager is that I use Xcode Gen as well, and with CocoaPods, I always have to run again CocoaPods pod install after the Xcode Gen generation because I have to double.
For that, actually, we have a script. We have actually a Ruby script actually that we use to generate our project every time. So that does everything. So even when we have a new developer that onboards on the first day, all they have to do is pull down the repo and run that script. It even installs all the dependencies like brew or anything that he needs.
We do that as well. It's a
exactly.
Makefile on our side.
Exactly. So by doing that, we go around that problem. So and we just you just run the script and you have everything that works for you. I think it's a good approach. So you don't have to deal. And if anything you need to modify, twist, you just do it in one place and everybody has the same behavior. And actually recently we were discussing internally how we can, because there's some packages that we want to use and we're trying to figure out how to make both coexist in a way that benefits us, because we recently saw the Swift Collections package that came out a couple of weeks ago, and it had some interesting things that I wanted to use, and we were trying to figure out how to make both coexist, especially having since we're trying to optimize even the build time of the application. So all of that comes in together, because the more dependencies you have, the more building time it takes, and so on and so forth. So it's always a matter of what's the most important thing for you. So
yeah, no, the problem is that every time having all the pods folder regenerated from scratch, exactly. It's not. I mean, sometimes it's really slowing us down, even with the caches and the derived data that are still there. I was personally looking for a way to download a precompiled version of an XG framework with Carthage, but it's not supported yet. And by the way, since many of you are more expert in security than me, would you advise against downloading a precompiled SDK, public SDK, or library from GitHub? I mean, could that be an issue of security? I don't know if any of you.
I think what we're doing internally, and I'll let somebody else speak. I'm sorry, guys. Fabrizio is basically doing it. We're doing it ourselves, so we're just getting it and creating the XG framework ourselves, just to be on the safe side. And because if you have the XG framework, you cannot actually debug the code. So we're gonna have depending on what you want to do, either we include the XG framework or we include the source code so we can debug it. So
I don't know, the other guys or ladies, if you want to.
I want to speak to that because just recently I had the story with one of my projects, Crypto Swift, when I supported the Carthage and CocoaPods forever, and then I decided, okay, there will be a Swift Packet Manager forever, but it was built from the source. And then I said, okay, that would be fine if I could ship the binary XF framework, right? There are benefits to do that in that particular project. And I ran in all possible problems, and none of the tool works properly with that. And the best one would be the CocoaPods, I would say, at the time. Eventually, after my battle, I revert the change and I continue deliver the source. And it is not good for the users. And this is why Swift Packet Manager has this thing when that if you use that as a dependency, and this is the Swift code, it will be built with a debug configuration most of the time when you work with that. But as you know, the Swift in the debug mode, when it's built, is like 1,000 times slower than in the release. So if you have that kind of dependency and you work with that, you don't touch this normally. You don't touch this code. You just use that. You notice, okay, this is slow. What's going on? And you waste time. Definitely, then you just rebuild that in the release, and it works. It works. So it would be great if Swift Packet Manager could have this different configuration. And the solution is to have it as a XF framework, right? That's the bundle you get. It's very easy to use. Yeah, but there are integration problems. So for now, I would, if I had a simple dependency that doesn't have like dependencies, I would just grab the X framework and drag it to the Xcode project and use it like that. That's the easiest possible installation today, because really X's framework is so easy to install and fastest from my perspective. Cartridge has all the problems now with the M1. CocoaPods also has some problems with the M1. Swift Package Manager, well, yeah, there's always something with that. So I don't know if there's ultimate package manager in our community.
Do you know if with SPM there's a way to integrate the dependencies in ways other than static libraries with the integrated Xcode one, I mean?
Yeah. So you basically, if you build the XS framework and you can create the XS framework out of the dynamic library or the static library, you just have this package that you drag, and you don't have to adjust any search path or nothing. It just works, and it's for me, it's the most convenient way.
You know, okay. I meant if there's a way from sources to integrate the auto-generated framework without having to create it yourself in advance. I mean, if I want to, I don't know, download and use Alamo Fire with SPM, if I try to integrate in my project, I will have to link it with a static library. What if I want to use a dynamic framework or an XG framework?
Yeah,
automatically.
I think it depends on the package manifest itself. There's auto mode or static, I think, or dynamic. You can choose, but that's what the maintainer chooses as far as I'm concerned, right?
And what about the others? I mean, struggles, takeaways for using dependency managers. Who wants to, you know?
Well, I can. For me, best and perfect way to deal with dependencies is CocoaPods. Yes, there are problems that is too heavy. Sometimes you need to put an intention to put a setting in your gitignore to not load all this stuff to your repository, and sometimes it could be really tricky to get correct CocoaPods, but you can specify the version of dependency you need to use. And for me, there is less struggling with CocoaPods than with Cartage, especially when you use Cartage and some private repositories. It can break all your Git settings, especially if you work with repositories from different maintainers and different companies. And all these companies have their personal settings for security. So it can be really problematically with Cartage. And and of course, the package manager is really easy, but though that not all repositories support Swift Package Manager, there is some problem with that not targets can support Swift Package Manager. For example, if I want to add Swift Package Manager to my application that uses app clips, I will get an error, and I cannot use such dependencies even in my main project. So I need to remove that, but I can add some CocoaPods, for example. And of course, it could take a lot of time when you need to build your repository, for example, with CI/CD, but it depends on your settings of this CI/CD. If speaking about XCF frameworks, it could also be some struggles. For example, if the maintainer put in a repository only a version for debug, but you cannot use this version of library for production and release. So it could be really, painful, too much sorrows and too much wasted time. So my choice is CocoaPods if I need to use a lot of different dependencies. I recommend that.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. I mean, even if you end up with maybe slower compilation time, I don't know. I mean, that's my experience as of now. What about the others?
For me, cartridge is dead, as far as I'm concerned. SPM replaces that for all the use cases I used it for. The things that's missing from SPM right now, the biggest thing for me is the lack of ability to do build scripting. So, for example, I think it's in review or it's accepted already, but basically I want to be able to do sorcery distribution using SPM, not as a framework, but as an executable. So I would imagine the same workflow for things like Swift format and SwiftLint would be ideal. So we could integrate those tools without having to either bring them through, either having the binary distribution directly, just copying the file, or using CocoaPods. So the biggest advantage CocoaPods have right now is because you can bring in anything, right? You can bring in executable. You can have executable targets in the SPM, but it doesn't work the same way. You cannot have it as a dependency in your project and run sorcery or run Swift format, all those tools directly, as far as I'm concerned. The other thing is you cannot do any kind of processing. So for example, with sorcery generates its own boilerplate. So sorcery generates code using previous versions of sorcery, which is very meta. And so for being able to do that, sorcery was originally an application and it was fake as a CLI because when I did sorcery in 2016, you couldn't have a CLI application with Swift. Simply didn't work. So the only way to have Swift frameworks in a command line tool was to have actual windowless Mac application. And that's how sorcery worked for many years. Sorcery is now built and distributed through SPM, but I need to run this processing, right? So I cannot use SPM build, like I cannot use Swift build to do all of the processing. I have to do my own scripting that does the pre-processing boilerplate and then use SPM to build the project. So that's very inconvenient to me as an open source maintainer. So when they add the ability, because so you can execute arbitrary code from the SPM package, but you're running in the sandbox environment. So you cannot create files, you cannot modify stuff. So when they add ability for us to attach scripts, build scripts to the SPM process, that will pretty much cover all of the use cases I have for still using CocoaPods. I would highly encourage not ignoring CocoaPods. I feel like if you have any kind of source code in your project, it has to be tracked, because what's going to happen if I remove my repo? Like 40,000 apps depend on some code that I wrote, and I just decide to delete that repo. You can have some fork or find some old version that someone forked, but that's an extreme risk for your company, right? So in my projects, I have always committed the source code into the main repository. And the other reason for that, outside of the fact that I might break something, is that in general, I've been programming for 24 years, and I regret whenever I didn't do it. Like I remember I built a game engine when I was in high school, and I wanted to run it on Vista, which was many, many years later. And I couldn't find the dependency that I used because I didn't have it in my source repository. And that, like, being able to replace that with a newer version that works on the system, on the old code base, was really, really long time. So the way I consider control version system is that I can jump in any place in my history and I should be able to run the project. I don't care what dependencies I used. All of the code has to be there, because if it's there, I can build it. Assuming I didn't use older Swift version and Xcode no longer works. But outside of that stupid thing, I want the code to always be compilable. And it doesn't matter if the external repositories no longer exist. This is something I built for years, right? And when we work in product companies, we maintain those products for many, many years. So I think that's really important from my perspective.
Yeah, and I would also add, given that I work a little bit, even like a lot on the financial apps, if your app is going to be audited at any point for security or good practices, you want to have also the source code available so that your auditor can get it, because otherwise it might be a big issue when the time for the audit comes.
Yeah, but look, at the same time, we depend on the huge system dependency with hundreds of frameworks that we cannot inspect by our own, and there are bugs like everyone else. And yeah, we still trust it, right? Either we trust Apple, or we trust Google, or we trust Amazon, or I don't know, one big company. I don't actually how you deal with that, how you trust, how you put the trust. Do you trust it more to these companies with the dependencies, or you treat it just with caution anyway?
I'd say there is definitely, as you said, maybe you could say a psychological part of it, which is that, I mean, the code from iOS and the frameworks is closed source. We know we cannot take a look at it, even if we wanted to. So I think we tend to say, okay, well, this is a given that we cannot look at it. So we're just going to assume that it works and there are non-vulnerabilities published, but we cannot go any further. But on the other hand, when you have an open source dependency, since an auditor is supposed to be able to check it, they're going to want to focus on it, because it kind of also, they say like, yeah, I'm doing my job, and they want to prove that they are doing their job. But I agree that definitely there might be more risk from a bug in a system framework, or something leaking from your analytics framework that is compiled and a binary, than from an open source project that has been reviewed as a big community. I definitely agree.
Okay, guys, I see lots of questions from the platform, so I'm trying to switch over there so that we can also answer to all of those questions again. So first one I'm going to do in a sparse order. In what situation do you think it's better to do a fork from the library and maintain it yourself? Anyone who, I don't know.
How we do it all the time, like always. If I have a project, I will fork it and maintain, like the update upstream whenever I do the update of dependency for the project. So I have it on the side, it doesn't change. And we don't know if the version change would be breaking or no. This is up to the maintainer. They maybe do some breaking changes like to the API or to the how the code behave unintentionally. We don't know that and all that stuff. Well, the other approaches, of course, do not fork and specify exact version, right? Yeah, that may work as well. But like with a fork, it's probably easier to do your own changes if you need to.
Okay, I will go quickly over the other questions. GDPR makes it, this is Antoine van der Lee, by the way, who maybe some of you may know. GDPR makes it hard to do the tracking lately with frameworks like Firebase and requires opt-in. Any third-party frameworks or other tracking solution to solve this?
I don't know the answer, but I know Antoine, and I just want to say, Antoine, did you try to move outside Europe? So that would be solution.
Well, I think that the best answer we could get for that. I mean, I will go, if anyone want to answer, please move forward. Otherwise, next one. Which app analytics tool would you recommend?
You're wrong.
Sorry.
Sorry, no, I just freaking hate analytics libraries. Most of them are so bad for your applications. That's the source of like so many crashes and so many bugs in the apps I have worked on over the years. If you need something, use something as small as possible, because like if you include Firebase, it's like a cancer. You have to include 20 other Firebase dependencies usually. So avoid the big ones. Do something that focuses only on analytics, so that it actually,
I would also
in general, I think.
I would also add that most of the time it's not up to us developers to choose which one dependencies to include. I mean, it's a business decision, unfortunately, that we
the business likes to include a lot of different ones for some reason.
Yeah. Well, I would recommend Segment, actually, which is a framework that is tracking server side. I mean, you track to Segment and then it switches to other tools.
Yeah, that's my recommendation as well. Like, because of the fact that, you know, I work in news industry, they want a lot of analytics in general, but we also have to accommodate for GDPR and stuff like that. My recommendation has always been build a, if you like, segment sounds cool, but generally build a service layer that you just do REST API calls to, and let that propagate anywhere else, because then you know that they don't do anything fishy, because there's no code of those libraries in your application, and it doesn't affect the build times. It doesn't affect your pretty much anything, right? A lot of those libraries swizzle code in your, to automatically track stuff, and not a lot of them know how to swizzle correctly. So you run into a lot of weird issues. Even Google did something with JavaScript that would spin on the main thread and kill our application. And we have a lot of users at the times, right? And we had to basically swizzle them out of their swizzling. So if you can, just use like a service layer and send using REST, and then propagate to anyone you want. It also has the benefit that you can add extra analytics, whatever you use, without the app update and without affecting your application.
Another thing I would like to see, I don't know if anyone is familiar with it, there's this analytics, it's only for web now, it's called Plausible. And I really like them because basically it's an open source project. They monetize it as well, but they have like all their code open source. Everything they do is transparent, and you literally know everything, and it's anonymous. Like, they do anonymous tracking. I really like them, and I would like to see them or anybody else like do something similar for mobile. But personally, I just hate analytics. And as Krzysztof already said, usually it's not up to us, it's up to like the business people to decide how many, not which, to include in the project. So
I really agree that this should be done on a server side. I actually used to have on one of those swizzle problems. There used to be a time where if you added Firebase and Facebook to your project at the same time, your app would be unable to open links, because they were both swizzling the same method. Absolutely disgusting. Like, how do you even ship something like this? But anyway, you could disable it and then it would fix, and so on and so forth. But those frameworks, they always bring like 10 billion dependencies that you have no idea what they're doing, and you don't need them at all. So I really like this idea, actually. You don't have those things in your app. This is actually deferred to your backend. So you just send something to your backend, and then there's some service in the backend that actually propagates this to the actual service. But the app itself doesn't know anything about it. I think that's a good way to go with this.
Yeah, they also, Facebook had a bug on its SDK some years ago that completely had troubles with Firebase. So the Firebase Crashlytics. So it was crashing so much that they had to disable Crashlytics for Facebook, for every project in the world using Facebook SDK. It was, I mean, an interesting event. I don't know if any one of you remembers that, but we had.
I don't think they had to disable it for Facebook. I think the amount of volume just crashed Crashlytics, right? That was ridiculous.
Where do the crash of Crashlytics goes? I mean, what would be nice. Another question from the audience is, how do you? What is the common reason to decide that a third-party tool is not good? Or how do you decide if a tool is good enough for you? I would go with GitHub stars because I'm lazy and don't want to look at the source of the code. No,
But that would decide if that particular tool is good or not. Like, usually to decide whether to include it, I would more be like, how much time would it take you? First of all, you have to understand the problem you're facing and what, like, how does it solve it for you, and how much it would cost you to do it like yourself. If you can do it yourself in a reasonable way and amount of time, I would not use a external dependency. If it's like way too much work, or like, then I would like opt to choose for different solutions. And yeah, probably stars are the best ways to validate a solution that you don't already know about.
As someone that has a lot of stars, let me just say you should not use stars as an indicator of quality, because the projects that have the most stars are usually visual. If you go into the most popular repos, you'll see that the highest ones are usually animations. Like there is a couple of pull to refresh libraries. If you look at the code, you'll kill yourself. don't yeah. Yeah, sorry.
Actually, I was incomplete. I usually look at the stars and the latest release and how is active the community. I mean, on the other hand, maybe a lower star repositories can be good, but it's not, I think, too much spread out in the world. That's what I was trying to tell. But yes, I agree with you. Yeah.
That's what I wanted to add is I would look at how often it's been maintained, when the most recent commit was. I check the issues and see if the issues are things that are going to bother my specific use case and go, oh no, I'm going to run into this. I look and see how many open pull requests there are and generally see if the repo is alive and kicking. So I don't want to endanger my code by trying to use something that's going to be obsolete very quickly and not maintained.
Yeah, I think checking the latest commit is also what I do. If I open a repo and there's like latest change 6 years ago, probably it's not even going to compile, so it's not even worth a check.
I like to look at the code and see if I understand it, because there are projects that are over-engineered. Like there are a lot of great projects that are really hard to understand. So I wrote my own FRP library for the times because we needed like a simpler FRP model, not like the full abstraction. And the reason I did that was because all of the open source projects were either full FRP, and usually additive to the fact that they were doing full FRP, which didn't really fit our needs, they weren't properly tested. Like I could never use a project that's based on algorithmic ideas like FRP is without full test coverage. Because that, to me, like that's immediately just crosses the project from my list. Obviously, the UI stuff you wouldn't have full test coverage, but I would like to understand the code that I'm going to use. And for example, Eric Swift is great, but if you go into the source code of that project, it's really complicated. So if you want to use Eric Swift, do you understand how it relates? Because it's like with the tooling we have, it's even hard to navigate and understand what's going on because there are so many protocol indirections in Eric Swift that it makes it really hard to read that code.
I use libraries in specific moments. For example, if there is something that I cannot do by myself, or for example, some complicated UI, or maybe some specific cases with specific sensors and etc. Several time ago, I was searching for library for RKit, and I found only one library that could be useful in my project, but it was also an outdated code and too much over-engineered. And so though their description of this library and what it should do was exactly what I needed at the moment, it didn't perform in the way I wanted to do. So in that case, I can see what is in the sources and maybe to repeat all this by myself in what architecture solution or maybe in what technology that I needed at the moment. So for example, it was in Objective-C, so I need to repeat it on Swift and to make it more applicable with my software and more useful for me in next cases.
Okay, moving forward with some other questions, guys. By the way, thank you for the answers. How do you deal with M1 incompatibility in many libraries? I have to use Xcode using Rosetta for them to compile, and then it crashes constantly. I guess that
we had this problem too. From our side, I tried to modify the library by modify the metro header to let the SDK compiles on M1 and using it on simulator, for example. And this is not a good solution, but we have to use it while we are waiting for an official release of that framework, for example. This works both for static libraries and dynamic libraries.
I would follow up a question from Josh Holtz. that it's asking, what third-party tool and framework has your favorite name? Names are most important thing when picking one. Who wants to try to answer that? I mean, the most funny name, I would go with, I have to think about that in a moment.
I personally love naming when dealing with the libraries. Usually when I do anything open source, I name it after a drink, alcoholic beverage, because I just love it. So, but it's usually because it's usually fun to name it in funny ways rather than just like crash lyrics or whatever. Just so that'd be fun. But personally, I use alcoholic beverages. So.
I love the name Fake. I don't know if you know. Fake is F# make. It's awesome.
No, didn't know about that.
At Just Eat, we started like this thing to call all our open source framework with just at the beginning. So like just persistent, just tweak. At some point we said, okay, probably we should stop. We should find other better names. But I think nice names are, I think like Alamo Fire is actually a flower or something like that. That's quite cool. So when I find some libraries with these names of things that I don't know, that's quite cool actually.
Well, in my point of view, I always try. I'm not a big maintainer like you guys. I mean, I never had more than, let's measure it with stars, more than 30 stars, I guess, on GitHub. But I try to put some irony inside all the library I create. So, for instance, I had to maintain and create my personal library for side menu controller. You know, the hamburger menu. And I called it PAX, like the IKEA wardrobe, because they have the sliding doors on the side. Or I'm maintaining a tool from the command line that helped me to maintain my skeleton project, which is the base app I start from to develop the full app. We do a lot of apps in a month. So since I had I needed a brain to handle my skeleton, I called him Murray, like the skeleton in Monkey Island, if you are familiar with that. Because for me it was the the head of the skeleton. But I don't know, for third-party frameworks at this time I can think about one specifically.
I also named one of my tool as Natalie, and it was Swift generator for the zip files or the how it's called, the UI things. Well, I called it Natalie because it means nothing, and it's my daughter name. So after all, if something will left, and I know the GitHub left is on the ice somewhere in the. Somewhere deep down. Yeah, that would be this name, which I find good.
There are also nice websites. There's two for remembering the closure syntax and the block syntax from NS, so for Objective-C. But I don't know if I can name it publicly like this. It was effing.
You can call it gosh darn.
Gosh darn block syntax and gosh darn closure syntax was really fun, but not a framework, just a website. So I try to move forward with some other question. Actually, I think we are over with time because it's already, almost time. So I think I have to wrap this up. Sorry, guys. Unless from the organization, they tell me no. Sorry, time's up. Times fly when you're having fun. So I have to thank you guys for being here. Sorry if this roundtable went south. I'm not so big moderator, but it was really a pleasure to have you all here. And thanks also for your work in the open source community, for those who do that. I've learned a lot from you in all these years, so it's a pleasure to speak with you. And thank you for being here at Swift Heroes. This
Thank you, Stefano.
Thank you so much.